introduce you to our speaker today. We have Professor Lisa Bortolotti, and she is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Birmingham in the UK, affiliated with the Philosophy Department and the Institute for Mental Health, and at the University of Ferrara, Italy, affiliated with the Department of Neurosciences and Rehabilitation. She works in the philosophy of the cognitive sciences, and her latest book is Why Delusions Matter. She's also the editor-in-chief of the interdisciplinary journal Philosophical Psychology. Currently, she is an investigator in EPIC, which is Epistemic Injustice in Healthcare, a project funded by the Wellcome Trust. It's my absolute pleasure to have her here today, and I will pass over to her for her presentation. I'll be back a bit later to field the Q&A. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many of you tonight for this seminar. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see some slides. I hope everybody can see it. And the title of the presentation for tonight is Depathologizing Delusions and Conspiracy Beliefs. So let me just give you a very brief introduction to this topic. Why is it that a philosopher is talking about delusional beliefs and beliefs in conspiracy theories? Well, because from the point of view of philosophy, it's extremely interesting to study ways in which we represent reality and interact with each other, which are thought to be sometimes difficult and problematic, not only because it might help us face certain situations in our lives, but also because very often it can help us understand better what is it that we do when we do not have those problems and those difficulties. So for philosophers, the study of delusions, at least initially, was about understanding better how is it that we form beliefs in general, and then work back like reverse engineering what might be going wrong with delusions. I've been working on delusions for quite some time, actually since my PhD many years ago. But recently, I've actually turned my attention as well to beliefs in conspiracy theories. And that was mostly because during the pandemic, when we had a new surge of conspiracy theories that were very often in the news, there was a lot of interest in what it is that makes conspiracy theories are problematic, rational or irrational, whether we want to consider them as something that we should engage with or that's something that we shouldn't even think about. And a lot of comparisons were made, not just in the research, but even in the press, between certain conspiracy beliefs that were quite implausible with delusions. So people were comparing delusions and conspiracy beliefs. In particular, they were saying that certain types of conspiracy beliefs, for instance, conspiracies about the COVID vaccine and so on, had very similar characteristics to some types of delusions, for instance, persecutory delusions or the delusions that we find in paranoia. And a lot of the comparison was aimed at showing that, well, if delusions are pathological beliefs, and delusions and conspiracy theories are quite similar, maybe we should conclude that conspiracy theories are also pathological, right? So that was the direction of the general argument, not everywhere, but in some opinion pieces and in some more scholarly articles as well. So let me say straight away that my approach in comparing delusions and conspiracy theories is completely the opposite. So I think that it's not a good argument to think that conspiracy theories, beliefs in conspiracy theories, are pathological because there are similarities with delusions and delusions are pathological beliefs. I think that it's worth thinking about the similarities and the dissimilarities between the two phenomena, because there are some interesting observations that we can make. And I think ultimately we can understand better those phenomena. But I don't think the conclusion should be that they're both pathological. Actually, my conclusion today will be that Neither of them are pathological phenomena. They are interesting phenomena that tell us a lot about how we think about reality, what explanations of events we find attractive, and how we behave in situations of crisis and distress. But they are not necessarily pathological. So what are the kind of research questions that motivate this kind of topic? Again, why is a philosopher talking about these things? Well, because it's not easy to decide whether something is pathological or not. Even medical professionals sometimes disagree about whether a certain type of behavior deserves medical attention or not, and whether a certain types of behavior is actually harmful for the patient or not. It's not really clear. There is a huge debate in the philosophy of medicine about the criteria for something to be an illness, a disease, a pathology, and so on. The other research question is whether this comparison between delusions and conspiracy beliefs is actually an interesting comparison to run, whether there is something that we can learn about this phenomena by comparing them. And my answer will be that, yes, there is something interesting to say, although I don't actually think that they share all features. I think that they are quite distinctive and there are some important differences. But what I will try and do in the talk is also show you the potential similarities. And then finally, of course, the question is, do we think that these similarities, if we believe that they are there, justify the conviction that actually they're both pathological phenomena? And my answer to that will be no. I don't think that's the view that we should take. I think that considering delusions and conspiracy beliefs pathological is conducive to bad relationships between people. It's, for instance, the reason why sometimes we decide not even to engage with people, not even to talk to them about certain topics, because we think they have nothing good to offer, because we think that the kind of things that they say are a symptom of an illness rather than a point of view that they are expressing. Now, of course, there are some points of views that are dangerous and harmful, when, for instance, people entertain certain hypotheses about certain groups that are already vulnerable, and, this kind of perspective may be characterized by forms of discrimination. Of course, there may be reasons why we don't want to engage with a certain belief, but I think the reason should be because those specific beliefs are harmful or have negative consequences, not because they are delusions or conspiracy beliefs. So being a delusion or being a conspiracy belief is not sufficient reason to decide not to engage with someone. So that's more or less the kind of landscape that we're thinking about today. I'm telling you now briefly what our plan will be, so you know what's coming. I will talk about different ways in which we interact with each other. And then I will talk about delusions and what arguments there are out there to think that they are pathological beliefs. And finally, I will look at certain ways in which we can draw analogies between delusions and conspiracy beliefs by looking at how they're formed, by looking at why people end up with those beliefs. Okay, so let's start with explaining and predicting. So the famous philosopher Daniel Dennett, who sadly recently passed away, had a lot of really cool theories that he is now identified with. But the part of his work that I like the best is that he had this idea that what we do when we interact with other people, but also with other objects and with other organisms like plants and animals, is that we really want to be able to explain and predict their behavior, because that is something very evolutionarily useful, but also something very rewarding, and that helps us achieve what we want in our lives. When we can explain why people act the way they do and predict what they will do next, we're going to, work a lot better with them. understand better what they might need from us, coordinate our efforts in order to achieve something together, and so on. So the general idea that Dennett proposed is that we have three different ways of explaining and predicting behavior. Sometimes we use the physical stance. So the physical stance is the attitude that a scientist, like a physicist or a chemist, would have. So the idea is that I want to know what something does and what that something will do next. And I'm going to find out just by using my knowledge of their physical parts, right? So for instance, if it is an organism, I'm going to use my knowledge of their physiology. If it is a mechanism, I'm going to use my knowledge of the kind of mechanics that makes that object work in that particular way. Alternatively, I can use the design stance. Now, the design stance is a little bit different from the physical stance because I can use it only to predict those kind of systems that have been designed in a certain way. So, for instance, if I want to know what my Zoom chat will do, because I know it's software that has been designed by someone, instead of thinking about the physical parts of it, I can think about the programming that went into creating that program or that app. Again, if you think about humans as the product of evolution, you may think that we have also been designed. It's not clear by whom, but we've been designed to behave in certain ways. So I can also predict the behavior of certain animals and human animals by using evolution, by thinking what is, the most obvious things that this system should do to survive in this environment. And I can try to predict their behavior this way. But then I thought that when it comes to other humans, when it comes to interacting with each other, most of the time, we don't use the physical stance and we don't use the design stance, but we use the intentional stance, which is also something that other philosophers call interpretation. So what we do in order to try and explain and predict each other's behavior is we ascribe beliefs and desires and other mental states to people. So suppose that I see my daughter sitting on the sofa with a very sad expression on, right? And I want to try and understand what's happening. And I remember that she just opened her email and read a message. So I can think of my daughter as someone who has an emotion like sadness. And I think that the sadness may be caused by a belief. So the belief that something is wrong. And maybe, I don't know, maybe the email that she received was very bad news. And now she's sad because something bad happened, right? So if you think about it, whenever we interact with friends and family members and colleagues and so on, we do this all the time, right? We try to understand what they may be thinking or feeling or desiring or wanting to do on the basis of their observable behavior. And of course, sometimes we get it wrong because we're not perfect. But sometimes we get it right. Also, people sometimes tell us what they're thinking, and that helps a lot with this. So when we interact with other systems in the world, we want to explain and predict what they're doing. And when it comes to humans, and maybe also animals that we are very attached to, like our pets, for instance, we tend to think of them as having beliefs and desires that lead them to act in a certain way. Now, there is a sense in which this kind of interpretation, so imagine that you are the interpreter trying to make sense of people, and the person you are interested in is the speaker, right? Or the agent, if they're not speaking at all. So this relationship between interpreter and speaker may be seen as a little bit objectifying, right? Why? Well, because after all, I'm not that different as an interpreter from the scientist who's trying to understand why water boils when you heat it up, right? And thinking about the physical composition or the chemical composition of water. So after all, I'm still, trying to predict what other people will do. And sometimes that may be useful for my own purposes. Maybe, I want to be able to predict what other people will do so that I can control them better, or can make them do the things that I want to do, and so on. So coordination and manipulation are part of these efforts of interpreting. So imagine that I'm a manager in a busy shop and I want to establish what everybody's shifts look like. I need to make predictions about when people will be available to work in the shop. I'm not treating the people as objects, of course, but I'm not that interested in their mental life over and beyond the task at hand. Or I may be interested in some of them if they're also friends, but that's not part of the picture. Again, if I'm playing chess with someone, maybe over the internet, maybe even someone I've never met, I'm not that interested in their rich mental life. All I want to know is what the next move will be, right? So I can also try to move in such a way as to have an advantage over them. So in a way, these kind of tasks that we have, playing chess or managing the rota of a busy shop, are such that they require interpretation, but they don't require a lot of engagement with the people around us. However, there are also situations where we are interested in the point of view of the people whose behavior we want to explain and predict. So we want to know a lot about the people around us sometimes, because in order to solve more complex problems or have more meaningful relationships, we need to see them as agents. So it's not enough that they have beliefs and desires and they act on them, but well, what does it mean to see them as agents? Well, it means that we may want to collaborate with them on a series of projects where their point of view is important to us. So we want to recognize maybe that they have a valuable perspective on the world and valid concerns. We want to be able to acknowledge that they have a multiplicity of interests and needs, not just the interests and needs that I need to take care of right now, but also interests and needs that go beyond the single task. They have the capacity to contribute to change because that's the core of agency, right? The fact that we can change things and make them happen in a certain way. And we think they're capable of making decisions, right? So if you think about a more complex situation, like your little brother comes home and tells you that he's being bullied at school, then, it's not enough to try and interpret what the problem is using the intentional stance. You might want to see things from their point of view, but you might want to use this agential stance. So sometimes we want to pursue common goals with people. I talk about epistemic goals because for the philosopher, epistemic just means something that has to do with knowledge. So I want to achieve things with other people. I want to work together with them to try and understand something, try to solve a problem, right? Trying to gain some knowledge that we didn't have before. And sometimes I value the collaboration of these other agents because they might have knowledge and skills that I don't have. So I recognize maybe that their point of view is interesting, not just because it's different from mine, but because in some respects, it might be better than mine, right? They might have a better understanding of certain phenomena. Or maybe I just want to collaborate with them because when we need to make a decision together, it's a decision that will affect both of us and not just me, right? So it's important that they are involved. So what I'm suggesting is that maybe we should have a fourth stance to accompany the ones that Dennett had mentioned, the physical, the design, and intentional stance. So maybe we should have an agential stance where we take other people not just to be physical systems or systems that have been designed or systems that have beliefs and desires, but systems that are agents, right? So intentional systems, of course, are already agents, but the agential stance point to those things that are over and beyond having intentional states. They have a unique perspective on the world. They have concerns that they're valid from their point of view. They have an intrinsic complexity. So sometimes they have interests and desires that kind of conflict with one another. They have the capacity to affect change, and they have the capacity to contribute to decision making. Now, the problem is that we do not take everybody to be an agent in this sense. And in order to make this case, I'm just going to tell you a story. So I teach at the University of Birmingham, and we have a system to monitor the students' attendance. The system is that on the day of the teaching, I receive a code. And when I get into the classroom, I write the code on the board, and the students input this code on an app, which means that the university knows that they have been attending my class, right? So it's an attendance monitoring system. So imagine that there is a new lecturer, Eva, and on Monday she walks into her classroom, greets her students, and she writes a string of numbers on the board saying, okay, this is the attendance code for today. And the students write it up in their app, and they're happy that, the kind of boring part of the class, the monitoring, the attendance part is done with. And now imagine a slightly different scenario. The following week, Eva walks in and writes a string of numbers on the board. But instead of saying this is the attendance code for this week, she says, this is the meaning of the universe. The KGB told me last night, and I'm telling you now, so you can prepare for what is to come. So initially, the students may be surprised and perplexed. They don't really know how to react. It may be that Eva is trying to make a joke, or maybe Eva is going to demonstrate something, or, they kind of wait to see what's happening. But then they notice that Eva's expression is very serious, that she actually seems to believe what she just said. And all of a sudden, their attitude towards their lecturer changes, right? Because if they are in a situation where they attribute a belief to her, for instance, the belief that that string of number is the meaning of the universe, then they need to attribute to her a delusional belief, right? So a belief that in their eyes is implausible, a belief that they do not share, a belief that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for them to explain what Eva is doing or to predict what she will do next, right? So whereas writing a string of numbers and saying this is your attendance code is exactly what the students are expecting, and then they're ready to start the class, they know what Eva will do next. When she starts saying something like this, something shifts, something changes. And in the past, some philosophers were suggesting that when people seem to be reporting delusional beliefs, the interpreters go from the intentional stance to the physical stance, right? Instead of thinking, okay, this is a system that has beliefs and desires and will act rationally on the basis of those beliefs and desires, they need to think about something physical that might be interfering with the cognitive capacities of that person. Or maybe they're intoxicated. Or maybe, they didn't take their medication, right? So the type of explanation changes. So one consequence of Eva's exchange with the students is that if they attribute beliefs to her at all, they will attribute to her beliefs that have a delusional quality, right? And this prevents them. This is my claim that that's what delusions do, not what they should be doing. Just it's an observation. This prevents the students from engaging with Eva in genuine attempts at collaboration, intended as the pursuit of common goals, right? So what they cannot see anymore is that Eva is an agent. They do not accept that anymore. They don't treat her as an agent anymore. So if she has a perspective on the world, it's not a valuable perspective for them to understand. If she has concerns, they're not valid concerns, and so on. So what they do is they withdraw the agential stance. Eva is no longer part of those people that they are happy to collaborate with. So this is an interesting way of trying to think about delusions, not in terms of what delusions are, but in terms of what they do to our social relations, right? To the way in which we interact with other people. And the philosopher Sam Wilkinson tries to convey this idea by talking about delusion attribution. So what does it happen when we say, oh, this person has a delusional belief? He says that we don't have a precise definition of delusion that we just apply onto the belief of that person and decide that they are delusional. That's not how it happens. According to him, there is no neutral description or definition of delusion. Rather, there is a judgment, a negative judgment that we make of that person. Because when we ascribe a delusional belief to someone, we're basically saying they're out of their mind, they don't know what they're saying, there's something wrong with them. Again, imagine you go from being an agent to be trusted, to be validated. You're going to become a system that has got some malfunctioning, right? So the interpreter implies that the intentional systems to whom they are tempted to ascribe delusional beliefs are not in the right mind, or they don't know what they're saying. And the way that Wilkinson puts it is that every delusion attribution is an expression of disapproval, right? Not an expression of disapproval of that person necessarily, but an expression of disapproval of their belief, right? Of that particular belief that attracts the label of delusion. What does this mean in practice? That if you are ascribed a delusional belief, you're often discredited as a source of unreliable information. And thus you're excluded from those kind of knowledge exchanges that we were talking about earlier. So what is interesting is that this happens with conspiracy theories as well. If we call something a conspiracy theory, that's not a neutral attribution. What we are saying is that there is something wrong about the theory. That the theory, yes, it involves a conspiracy, but also maybe doesn't have enough evidence, or it is implausible, or, I wouldn't have that theory. So there is also an expression of disapproval there. So the attribution of a belief as a delusion or as a conspiracy belief reveals something important about the attitude that the interpreter has towards the content of that belief. And it affects the relationship between the interpreter and the speaker, right? They are no longer going to be engaging in similar projects. Now, in a longer version of this paper, I consider various examples from newspapers where people follow the statement that someone is delusional or that someone's belief is a delusion with an explicit decision to withdraw their engagement from that person, to stop talking to that person about that topic. Because I think it's quite interesting to notice that that's our practice. That's what people do, right? Now here I will just give you one example that I got from Reuters. When they said this, so the executive director of South Africa's Presidential Commission on Climate Change called the country's coal industry delusional because it wasn't recognizing the challenges of climate change. And immediately after that, he added, it's going to be impossible to have a conversation with the industry if we can't get past their basic denialism. So because they have a belief that is not just wrong or false or irrational, but it's delusional, then it's not worth talking to them about that topic, because it's not going to be a productive conversation. There cannot be grounds for collaboration. And there are lots more examples also between people from the same family. When they had different views about COVID, they stopped talking to each other about that topic and so on, right? So we stop engaging. That's something that we observe. So I'm interested in knowing why. So why is it that this happens? Why many of us think that engagement is no longer interesting or useful when people have delusional beliefs or conspiracy beliefs? And I think that the answer is that we assume that that belief is no longer an expression of the person's agency, but it is a symptom of a disease. Right? So it's something that, we go from the intentional stance or the agential stance to the physical stance. It's just a malfunctioning. It's not really what they want to say. It's not really what they think. If they could think straight, they wouldn't say that. That's why the question whether delusion and conspiracy beliefs are pathological is important. Because if we end up thinking that they are pathological, I think we will be more and more tempted and motivated to act in this way, to refuse engagement. Okay, so now let me go back to the question whether delusions are in fact pathological. That's the common view. So if you start reading psychology papers or papers written by psychiatrists on delusions, very often in the first paragraph or two, they give you a definition of delusion, and they often start by saying delusions are pathological beliefs. But I think that's something that we say, but maybe sometimes we don't think very carefully about, right? So I think personally that the label pathological is not really something suitable to be attached to something like a belief in isolation from lots of other things, right? But what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes when we call beliefs pathological, we are not actually meaning that they are part of a disease. We are meaning something else. So we use pathological a bit as in a metaphorical, figurative sense. We may think that they are difficult to understand or very irrational, or, you know, they don't seem to do the work that normally beliefs do, right? And people have used these arguments to deny to delusions the status of belief. Or to say, look, if you really want to call delusions beliefs, then you have to say that they're also pathological because they don't work the way they're supposed to work. But that's, I think, just a non-literal sense of pathological. Because these are, you know, interesting characteristics of delusions if we think that delusions have them, but they are not really anything to do with pathology as such. We can have a lot of weird or irrational beliefs that, you know, are not necessarily pathological. I think beliefs are called pathological in a proper sense, in a literal sense, when they're caused by or they're part of a disorder or a pathology, right? But of course, people and philosophers among all people tend to disagree a lot about what counts as a disorder. And this happens in medicine generally, not just in psychiatry, but, you know, people disagree about what should be considered criteria for pathology. I think the most common views are these three, right? So people may think that a belief is pathological either because it's caused by a process that is dysfunctional, or because it's caused by a process that is dysfunctional and has harmful effects for the person who has the belief, or because, you know, no matter whether it is caused by a dysfunction or not, it has harmful effects for the person with the belief. Right? So those are the standard views about pathology and disorder. In medicine in general, we can apply them to belief in order to see whether any fit the case of delusions. Let me talk about the criterion of harmfulness very briefly, because you take too long to make justice to this idea. Of course, you may think that a delusion is harmful. Right? And there are really good cases where I think you'd have an argument for that is difficult to challenge. So think about delusions of guilt, where people think that all the evils of the world are due to them. And because of those reasons, they harm themselves. That seems to be obviously a harmful delusion for that person to have, right? But in most cases, why are delusions harmful? Is it because the content of the belief is harmful, or is it because of something else? So it may be that, you know, the belief has a harmful content, or it may be that the belief and, you know, some other harms that are loosely related to the belief have a common cause. Or it may be that the harm comes not from having that particular belief, but from the fact that people exclude you and discriminate you when you have that belief. Right? So of course, having delusions is harmful and you may feel isolated, but is it because the belief does that? Or is it because other people react to the belief in a way that is not conducive to good relationships? So I will leave that on the side because, again, it's a big conversation to have. But all I want to say here is that it's not obvious that delusions are harmful because of their content, and especially it's not obvious that all delusions are harmful because of their content, right? So let me focus on the dysfunction criterion, which is what has interested philosophers the most. The idea is that if you are pathological, if a process is pathological, it's because it is due to a dysfunction or a deficit. And in particular, if you are thinking about the pathology of a belief being pathological, then the kind of dysfunction needs to be about your cognitive mechanism, so the capacity to process information, right? Because after all, beliefs are representations of reality. So there are different views about delusions, how delusions are formed, and most of them do not involve any deficit, right? Any dysfunction. But there is one theory, the two-factor theory, according to which there are deficits that lead to delusions, maybe a perceptual deficit accompanied by a reasoning deficit. So according to the two-factor theory of delusions, that explains why people come up with delusions, it may be that delusions are the output of a cognitive dysfunction. Then there is another theory of delusion formation, which is the prediction error theory. So the idea is that our brain is a predictive machine. We make hypotheses all the time that guide our action. Sometimes the brain is telling us that our hypothesis is false and we need to revise it, even if that's not the case. So that's a prediction error, a signal that's, tells us that there is an error even when there isn't an error. And that's how delusions come about. So again, here there seems to be a dysfunction, but maybe not at the level of the cognitive mechanism, more at the level of perception. And so it doesn't look like we have good grounds for thinking that delusions are the outcome of a dysfunctional mechanism in that way. And finally, there is a one-factor theory of delusion formation, which tells us that there is no cognitive dysfunction at all. That is just, the way we experience things that might cause the delusion. And if we experience things that way, then it makes sense to form the delusional belief. So it's not that you need to experience things in a difficult, unusual way, and then you need another cognitive problem, deficit that leads you to adopt the delusional belief. It's just that it's natural that if you experience things that way, then you're drawn to delusional beliefs. So in the one-factor theory, you exclude openly the possibility that delusions are pathological in this sense. So let's go back to the two-factor theory, because that's the only hope, I think, for people who want to say that delusions are pathological. So Langton and Coulter, for instance, say we advocate a deficit model of delusion formation. That is, delusions arise when the normal cognitive system, which people use to generate, evaluate, and adopt beliefs, is damaged. So you've got a very obvious, explicit endorsement of that view. But what is this cognitive deficit doing? What are the effects of this mechanism that is malfunctioning? So there seem to be two problems that we might think about when we think about the outcome of this deficit. One is that normally we have the capacity to inhibit implausible hypotheses. So sometimes we form hypotheses that are very weird or not very well kind of supported by the other things that we know, but we have a mechanism that tells us, careful, Lisa, this is an implausible hypothesis. And as a result of that, we reject that hypothesis and we come up with a different hypothesis, right? So suppose that I've had a pint of beer and I go in the back garden of the pub and I seem to think a green man is sitting across the garden. And, the first hypothesis that I might have is, oh, there is a green man in the garden. But then I think, no, there are no green men, really. I might have had too much to drink, or maybe it's too dark, I cannot see properly. So I reject the implausible hypothesis. Now, one idea is that people who are prone to delusions don't have these mechanisms that helps us reject the implausible ideas. The other option is that, maybe I have some unusual experiences and it's quite normal that then I adopt unusual hypotheses in order to explain those experiences. And that's not pathological. But what becomes problematic is then I receive a lot of counter evidence, so evidence against that hypothesis. And yet I do not give it up, right? So the idea is that, normally we have this capacity to recognize that if a lot of things seem to tell us that our belief is wrong, then we should really stop having that belief and maybe suspend judgment or have a different type of belief. But this doesn't happen in people who have delusions. Now, what can we do with this kind of two outcomes of the deficit? If it is a problem with how we form beliefs, that we cannot inhibit unusual hypothesis, then it seems that we are not really considering the fact that our unusual experience may be very powerful. It may be something that leads us to adopt an implausible hypothesis, because the implausible hypothesis is actually the only one that could make sense of that experience. If it is a problem with how we keep our beliefs, even when they seem to be conflicting with evidence, then it seems as if we're saying that, there is a problem with how we evaluate beliefs once we have adopted them, right? So one is a problem with how we decide to have a certain belief, and the other one is a problem with how we decide to maintain that belief, not to give it up. But in both cases, the kind of things that I've been describing, adopting an implausible hypothesis or not rejecting a belief that has been disconfirmed by the evidence, are by no means unique to delusions, right? So there are a lot of beliefs that we have which are a little bit mad in content. Other people do not agree with us, or that, we don't really want to give up, even when we seem to receive a lot of opinions against it. That doesn't seem to require any particular deficit, because those kind of beliefs that I'm thinking about are definitely not pathological. They're not linked to any disorder. It seems as if endorsing implausible beliefs and maintaining a belief that are disconfirmed by evidence are not unusual occurrences, are things that are common in the population that doesn't necessarily have any diagnosis. So one possibility is that instead of being caused by a dysfunction, by a cognitive deficit, they are instead caused by biases. And we all have biases, and we tend to have all the same ones. Although in some circumstances, people who are prone to delusional beliefs or conspiracy beliefs might have those biases to a greater extent than the population that doesn't have this tendency to adopt delusions and conspiracy beliefs. What does it mean that something is a bias instead of a deficit? So the deficit tells us that our brain is built in such a way that it has a defect, right? So there is a proper malfunctioning. The bias is not necessarily a defect, it's a tendency to think things in a certain way, to process information in a certain way, which in some contexts can be harmful and can lead to irrational beliefs, but that in other contexts is actually quite helpful, right? And we need to be able to distinguish between those two. So in particular, we can think about biases in gathering data, in processing data. We can think about psychological needs that we have. Very often we don't want to give up a belief, not because we don't recognize that there is evidence against it, but because we're very attached to that belief. It'd be quite painful for us to give it up. And the biases kind of account for this variation. And there needs to be there doesn't need to be anything pathological about the beliefs that are produced by using biases. And in some sense, as I was suggesting earlier, there could be good biases. So in some cases, it's a good idea that people don't give up beliefs too easily, because sometimes they may happen to be right, even if the majority of people is against them, right? So what I'm saying is that with the bias, it's the context that makes the difference. There is no deficit that is bad in all situations. But there may be a tendency of thinking things in a certain way that serves us well in some environments and serves us less well in other environments. So now I want to focus on the analogies between delusions and conspiracy beliefs that we might notice if we agree that maybe, yes, there are biases at play, but not necessarily any deficit. So let me show you a very brief video.
How do conspiracy theories take hold? Our supply of seeds is gone. It's a disaster. This trail of seeds leads to Beetle. He must have taken our seeds.
Don't jump to conclusions. How can you be so sure that it was Beetle? We haven't gathered enough clues yet. Spider, what do you think? Grasshopper's theory makes sense. Yesterday, Beetle was ogling your seeds. He must have decided to steal them in the night. Today, your seeds are gone, and now he's fast asleep. Grasshopper's theory makes sense. I give you that, Spider. But looking at all these leaves off the branches and the nests fallen on the ground, isn't it more likely that the strong wind last night scattered our seeds around? Grasshopper, you are stuck. When you can't stand the uncertainty, you may be tempted by an intriguing story. A story that is simple and coherent and points to someone else as the villain. When we do not know how a new virus emerged, we may speculate that evil scientists created it in their lab. But we should wait and gather more evidence, because once we commit to a theory, it is difficult to give it up.
Okay, so I hope you could hear the story. It's a version of the ant and the grasshopper, so there is a fable that we created to illustrate some of the biases that might affect our explanation. So what's happening? Grasshopper wakes up one morning to find that the supply of seeds for the winter is gone. And this is a high stress situation, right? Because losing the seed means that the winter will be very difficult without food supply. So he looks around and sees a trail of seeds leading to Beetle, who is sleeping peacefully in the grass. And Grasshopper becomes certain that Beetle stole the seeds and tells his friend Ant about it. Ant notices that there are some seeds scattered on the ground and observes that many leaves and broken branches are there all over the garden, which makes her think that there must have been a very windy night, and maybe that's what's responsible for scattering the seeds. She also seems to think that Grasshopper is too eager to blame Beetle for what happened, right? So both Ant and Grasshopper are looking for explanations for an event that is very distressing for them, but they go about it in different ways. Now, the first question, when I show this video to primary school children, because I talk to them about explanation as well and biases, is there anything wrong with Grasshopper? I mean, what is it doing that is not right? To some extent, Grasshopper is a good guy, right? Is trying to look for clues. Is trying to find an explanation for something that happened. But one thing that is quite interesting is that he's not very open to listening to alternative explanations. He tends to stick with his own explanation to the point that he remains trapped. He remains trapped in the spider web, right? Because he can no longer get away from it once the spider has made his story so convincing, you know? So what we may ask here is, you know, what is Grasshopper here? Is he representing the kind of biases or attitudes the people who form delusions or conspiracy beliefs have? And does it mean that, you know, Grasshopper is someone we cannot really collaborate with? So I think what Grasshopper does is illustrate very well a number of biases that are characteristic of how we make explanation under uncertainty. And one is the JTC, so the jumping to conclusions bias. Grasshopper does not wait to gather further information once he identifies the trail of seeds. So we could even describe what he does as jumping to conclusions. So we jump to conclusions when we make a decision or opt for an explanation of an event without waiting to have sufficient evidence to support that decision or that explanation. So it's not that we don't have any evidence. It's just that there may be alternative evidence that might actually convince us that things went differently, but we don't wait and see what happens there. Now, the jumping to conclusion bias is very important in the delusion literature because there is a lot of convincing evidence that has then been made also quite controversial in later studies, that people who are prone to delusional beliefs, in particular delusions of persecution and paranoia, have a very strong jumping to conclusion bias, which means that they tend to jump to conclusion a lot more than people who do not have the tendency to form those delusions. So there is a very, as I was saying, a strong history of relationship between jumping to conclusion and delusions. And mostly people disagree on how to define the jumping to conclusion. So what is it the jumping to conclusion really amounts to, rather than doubting that there is a link there. And what is also interesting is that jumping to conclusion is not unique to people who have delusional beliefs. We all jump to conclusions, and in some situations, situations of crisis, we tend to jump to conclusion more than other situations. So in non-clinical samples, subjects who displayed the jumping to conclusion bias also presented a more pronounced belief in conspiracy theories. So here is the first analogy that both people who are prone to delusion and people who are prone to accepting conspiracy beliefs seem to jump to conclusion more than the rest of us. We all jump to conclusions. We all jump to conclusions more when we are uncertain or under stress, but they seem to be, again, an exaggerated bias in some of these more kind of delusional or conspiracy belief type of samples. What does it mean? That people who gather less information before making a decision seem to endorse conspiracy theories more strongly. So they don't necessarily have more conspiracy theories. It's just that they have some conspiracy theories, but they tend to believe them very strongly, and it's very difficult for them to give them up. And recently there has been a study in Germany that also found higher level of conspiracy belief endorsement associated with greater jumping to conclusion bias and paranoid ideation. So there seems to be a correlation between them. So Sanchez and Dunning, though, want to make very clear that the jumping to conclusion bias is not a symptom of a disease, it's not pathological, right? So they even call it going with our guts, right? So it's something that we are all prone to, especially in situations where we need to make quick decisions. That said, people with certain personality traits or thinking style may jump to conclusion more, right? And the factor that seems to help us really avoid jumping to conclusion is to be able to increase our tolerance to uncertainty. So it is actually when we are very unsure about what is going to happen next. Think about the pandemic, for instance, as a scenario where there was a lot of uncertainty, that we develop more jumping to conclusion bias. But that's not the only bias that we may be interested in. So as you might have noticed in the story, Grasshopper blames Beetle for the disappearance of the seeds. And that's very common. So we all have a tendency to believe that when something significant happens, especially something bad, right, something tragic, it is because someone wanted it to happen. So we are looking for a villain everywhere. And this is often called intentionality bias, which is associated with schizophrenia-like symptoms also in individuals that have no particular diagnosis. So the persecutory delusions held by some patients may be explicable in terms of an exaggerated intentionality bias, with these patients being more prone to seeing events that happen to them as caused by someone's intention rather than being arbitrary or random. Now, not all the studies that you can find really focus on this correlation between conspiracy beliefs and intentionality bias as such. But there is a special version of the intentionality bias, which seems to have a strong correlation with conspiracy beliefs, and it's called hypersensitive agency detection, which is the tendency to attribute intentionality and agency to events or inanimate objects that shouldn't have any. So if you see the seeds there and you think, no, it's not the wind, it's actually beetle, it's because you think beetle might have an intention to harm you, to steal from you, while the wind doesn't have that kind of intention, right? And that has been also found quite consistent in a study where accentuated intentionality bias is detected in schizophrenia. Again, the authors remind us that this is a bias that we all have. So it's important to consider the differences in schizophrenia in the context of the normal biases shown in subclinical population, rather than thinking of these biases as present in populations with schizophrenia and absent from normative populations. So in other words, it's a lot of words just to say that there is strong continuity there. We all have those biases. Some of us have it a little bit more than others, but those biases are also more likely to affect us, affect our way of thinking when we are in conditions of uncertainty and distress. For example, most people show some degree of intentionality bias, and this might not be an issue. However, problems may arise for those with schizophrenia because they show an amplified bias for intentionality or because they have trouble controlling that bias. So again, the bias is not something that singles out conspiratorial beliefs or delusional thinking as processes that are characterized by a dysfunction, but it tells us that, that it's just part of our thinking, how humans think. How about join the dots bias? Grasshopper, what does it do? It infers causal links between a number of facts that are happening in the story, right? That is able to observe. The seeds have gone, there is a trail, the trail leads to beetle, beetle is sleeping. So obviously, the beetle must be sleeping because his belly is full of seeds. And in a way, they're all here in the story of the person with this kind of join the dots bias, causality bias, is the spider who creates this beautiful story with the spider web. So Elena Matute says the causality bias, or join the dots, occurs when people believe that there is a causal relationship between events that are actually independent of each other. As it happens, it's very difficult for humans to be able to know when two events are causally correlated. We often imagine that if something happens first and then something else happens, then the second event must be an effect of the first event. But that's not always the case, right? And we do make lots of mistakes when we try and identify causal relationships between things. And that's simply because identify causal relationships is really hard, although it is also very important because that's how we do science, right? We couldn't offer any scientific explanation if we didn't rely on the evidence that we've got in order to kind of detect causal relationships between things. So it's not surprising that we make mistakes in identifying causal relationships. And one proposal is that delusions actually emerge when people connect events that might not have any actual connection, right? So it may be a case of causal illusion, just like what was happening to Grasshopper trying to find an explanation for the missing seeds. And again, although causality biases are more prominent in delusional thinking and conspiratorial thinking, there is a clear continuity with the way that all of us join the dots across contexts. So one key feature of conspiratorial thinking is the rejection of the idea that a significant event could be due to a coincidence, right? Accompanied by the suggestion that there is a causal connection instead, even when such connection seems vague and implausible. And I think we've all seen this during the pandemic, where, the pandemic was a very important, significant event. We wanted to attribute, if possible, to someone's evil intentions, but also we didn't really accept the fact that it could be just, something that happened. We want to identify causal relationships with other things that had happened just before in order to be able to offer an explanation that was dispelling the uncertainty that we were feeling, right? So perceived causal connections are an important factor in the adoption of conspiracy beliefs, especially in studies that have been done on science denialism and the capacity to distinguish fake news. And seeing connections where there doesn't seem to be any connection contributes to the denial of scientific explanation and makes it harder for people to recognize misinformation. So there is a correlation there. Okay, so I've been talking for a long time, so let me get to some conclusions here. What I've tried to show you in this last section is really that there are some biases that seem to characterize delusional thinking and conspiratorial thinking, but these are not plausibly the outcome of any cognitive dysfunction. Rather, they are the outcome of biases that we all have and that we recognize in our own behavior as well. So, what can we conclude from this? It seems as if conspiracy beliefs and delusions do have some cognitive antecedents in common, which is a fancy way to say that some causal mechanisms for the formation of these beliefs may be shared. For instance, we looked at jumping to conclusions, we looked at hypersensitive agency detection and intentionality bias, and causal illusions. We could have looked at other biases as well, but those are the ones that we focused on. The first thing to say is that these beliefs do not need to emerge as symptoms of a pathological conditions. And we've seen over and over again different psychologists and researchers stressing the fact that there is continuity in how these biases manifest. Cognitive biases are not restricted to pathological states, and they often appear in healthy individuals and even in experts, right? Even experts in a particular subject find it very difficult not to be vulnerable to those biases when they're thinking about that subject. The other thing to say is that, you know, we were saying that maybe what's happening with delusions and conspiracy beliefs is that if we attribute them to people, then we stop thinking that those people are the kind of people that we can collaborate with, because they're no longer agents. We don't treat them as agents anymore. But if I'm right, and if you have followed me so far, you will have seen that delusional beliefs and conspiracy beliefs are expressions of agency. They're not denials of agency. Why? Because delusions and conspiracy beliefs emerge in those situations where we exercise agency. We need an explanation. We have to make a decision. We want to solve the problem. And given the data that we've got and the constraints that we have in terms of time, those are the explanations that we come up with. But they're not accidents, or they're not malfunctioning of things. They're just ways of coming up with a solution that is probably imperfect, that is not the final solution, the optimal solution to our problem, but it's definitely an expression of agency in that sense. So what does this mean for, the considering delusions and conspiracy beliefs as pathological? How can we overcome this idea that delusional and conspiracy beliefs are pathological? I think we should recognize that some of the biases and thinking styles that are at least partially responsible for conspiracy beliefs and delusions can be a problem, can be an obstacle to achieving our epistemic goals in some contexts, and can actually be productive and useful in other contexts, right? So it may be that in some contexts, grasshopper is doing the right thing, that looking at situations where there is a lot of competition, a lot of danger, and only the people who tend to be less trusting of others survive, then it makes sense to think that if something bad happened, then it's very likely that someone was responsible for it. But in an environment that is not like that, is not high risk, there are no limited resources, then grasshopper may be overly negative when it comes to consider the intentions of others. The other thing to consider is that our lay conception of conspiratorial and delusional thinking as something that defies agency is no longer tenable. The key features of the belief-forming processes that lead up to delusions and conspiracy beliefs are continuous with key features of non-pathological human cognition and agency. So there are no obvious cognitive antecedents of delusions and conspiracy beliefs that are not also antecedents of beliefs, full stop. So it's not that delusions and conspiracy theories are formed in ways that are completely different from the way that we form our standard non-conspiracy beliefs, non-delusional beliefs. The mechanisms are exactly the same. It's just that sometimes biases are accentuated in certain conditions of uncertainty and distress. And so the explanations we come up with are end up being more idiosyncratic and less shared. At least that's how I'd like to see it. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for a very interesting and thought-provoking session. I think I know about some of these topics as I, work in it day in, day out, thinking of new ways to, approach and conceptualize what is known as psychosis. But I definitely felt like I learned some new stuff today and challenged some assumptions that even I had. And we look like we've got a good reaction here in the chat of others who found it similarly useful. So thank you so much. So I'm just looking at the Q&A box now. I just want to invite folks who've been watching. If you have questions you'd like me to pose, please put them in the Q&A box now, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. Before I start on some of those questions, I just want to reflect on some of the chat that we've had in the chat box. So as I had kind of introduced this session at the beginning as being very topical right now, others were also talking about the socio-political environment and how that all plays into delusions and conspiracy theories. And I was really reflecting just now at the beginning, beginning of your talk, where you mentioned that how the professor Eva, who wrote the code on the whiteboard, and how that changed people's assumptions of her. I was reflecting on that and thinking of how there's a lot of weaponization of delusions right now. And let me explain that. So at least in America, one side, the political party, may accuse the other of having derangement disorder. And then the other side may then point to the other side and say, no, you've got conspiracy theories, tinfoil hat, etc. It occurs to me through your talk what a humanizing perspective this is, as you're really seeking to understand, like the cognitive biases and the process of each other's thinking, through this approach. So I'm wondering how you think approaches such as this may help us to bridge some of these divides in society.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's also partly my motivation for thinking about this topic. The fact that I recognize a lot of polarization in the way that people debate important issues, not just in the US, but everywhere actually. Where the idea is that it's very easy to start from the observation that someone has a different view from yours and end up with the belief that, if they have that view, then there's something wrong with them, right? Either they are unable to take into account the evidence, or they are reasoning in a bad way, or, they're, again, something wrong with their mental life. And it seems to me that this is not the best attitude to have, because it does prevent people from exchanging views in a way that doesn't make any of these debates advance. So people just tend to stick to their own views, especially when these are very central to their own identity. So we talked about science denialism, right? So very often people who deny climate change or are opposed to the efficacy or safety of vaccines, they don't just have these beliefs because they happen to have very strong convictions about vaccines or climate change. And that's the same with people who instead love, the climate change or love vaccines, right? So it's not just that these topics themselves drive them, but it's all way of thinking about the world, right? So usually you've got this sense that if you are suspicious about science and medicine, then it's because you think that intervening in the natural world might be a bad thing, and there are better ways of fixing the way that we live. Or if you love science, you might think that, maybe, all the good evidence and the good data comes from hard science, and you cannot find anything interesting out there. So I'm exaggerating here, but what I'm trying to say is that even the single belief is not there in isolation. Very often we want to link it with aspects of ourselves, of our values, maybe religious values or political values, and then makes it even more difficult to be open-minded towards other people. Because when you are rejecting my opinion about climate change, you're not just rejecting one of my beliefs, you're rejecting me, right? You're rejecting my values, you're rejecting the way that I see the world. So in a way, thinking of conspiracy beliefs and delusions not as pathological, but as expressions of our agency is also recognizing that they may be expressions of our identity as well. And this doesn't mean that we cannot be open to kind of revising them or changing our mind, or even just see things at least for 5 minutes from the point of view of someone else, right? Because sometimes the point of debate is not really, to change people's minds, but is to show them the reasons why you are seeing things in a certain way and making them understand, what concerns you have. And very often when people focus on the concerns rather than the arguments for or against a certain view, there is a lot more overlap, a lot more that can be shared than if they just focus on the arguments for and against, right? Because we all want to be healthier and happier and have meaningful lives. So there is a lot that is actually in common, even between people who have polarized views. But yeah, I think this view is exactly trying to do that. Don't take away agency from people just because they think about things in a different way.
Thank you. I think that was a very important point that you made there. So one question we had in the Q&A, I think, is a nice follow-up to that, because we're talking a bit now about societal beliefs, and maybe now this question brings it more back into the clinical mental health space. Yes. So the question is, so effectively, we as therapists are helping our clients deconstruct their delusions or conspiracy theories and see what lies behind in order to be able to reinforce their sense of agency and well-being. Is that the approach that you think mental health professionals should be taking?
Yeah, so I mean, this is also very interesting talking about delusion, because it comes at a time where there is a lot of change, I think, in psychiatry. And yet I'm being a bit tentative here because I know that psychiatry is done very differently in different countries and in different cultures. But definitely in the UK, I think like in the US, there used to be a very strong biomedical approach to schizophrenia and other conditions that often manifest with delusions, which I think might have given this idea that, the delusion is really just a malfunction to be fixed. And, it's not something that tells us anything meaningful about the person who has the delusion. And so the idea was, I'm not really listening to what you're telling me when you're telling me about your delusion. I'm writing my notes and not even making eye contact sometimes. I'm not even engaging with what you're telling me. I'm not asking you to explain a little bit better what your experience is. I'm thinking, okay, does this fit the criteria for delusion? Yes. Okay, so that's the pill that you need, right? And I think luckily we're really moving away from that. At least I see a lot of good signs. Like there is a lot more engagement when I present these views in people who are clinicians, and especially clinicians who work with young people who have maybe their first episode of psychosis, as it's described. And there is much more attention to what the delusion is a sign of, in the sense of what does it represent for the life of that person, for their experiences, for their relationship with their family, with their friends, with school, with work. Because very often the delusion may sound a bit wild, a bit implausible, a bit bizarre, but when you look at it, it's actually telling you something quite meaningful about what happened to that person. And I have, I've worked with people who have done quite interesting work, like interviews with people who had delusions. And these were kind of qualitative research. So, the researcher was sitting there for hours with the person. And sometimes the person was saying, I never said this to my psychiatrist. Because, they don't have the time to talk about this thing. Nobody asks them, because my student was asking them, So, how did you come to think of that? When was it the first time that you felt that this was the case? And they discovered lots of interesting correlations between life events, real life events that these people had, and the content of their delusion, so that they could actually understand them, a lot more. That's why they are expressions of agency. They're not random utterances or strings of words. And I think we got a lot more this recognition that it is a person expressing a belief. It's not just like a malfunctioning system or a brain that doesn't represent reality as it should.
Yeah, what you're saying really relates to a lot of new approaches that we hear talked about often in terms of voice hearing,
Yes.
meaning making from psychosis. We hear it a bit less with delusional thinking, I think, and perhaps some of your work is kind of changing that narrative. One of the questions that we had was about those similarities between hallucinations and delusions, and the person was wondering if there's commonality in the development of these experiences and if they can be addressed in the same way. I mean, you spoke a bit about that and wanting to understand the meaning, but did you have any more reflection on
I think
hallucinations versus delusions?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've worked quite a bit with the Voice Collective, which is a group of young people who hear voices, 16 to 25, who are kind of supported by a mental health organization in the UK called Mind. It's a mental health charity, and we have been talking about their own experiences, and very often, some of these young people have both kind of unusual experiences. They don't call them hallucination in the group, but and unusual beliefs, so things that would be called delusions. And I think the story that we hear when we think about delusion formation is that very often the unusual experience is one of the causal paths towards the delusion, so towards the unusual belief. So is it because you hear something or you see something that other people cannot hear or cannot see that you come up with some kind of explanation for that experience that sometimes other people find implausible, first because they don't share the same experience, and then because the kind of hypothesis that you come up with has to make sense of something that is very unusual. And so it ends up being very unusual as well, right? So there is definitely a correlation there. And in some situations, for instance, thinking that, someone has inserted a thought into your mind, this kind of, they're called delusions, like the thought insertion delusion, but actually, people have noticed there is very little difference with certain types of auditory hallucinations. So like hearing a voice or having a thought in your mind that you don't feel is your own are actually experientially very similar. So it might be more difficult actually to distinguish them than we thought. So I think there is a strong correlation there.
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with those assumptions that you made. One thing that came up in the chat, and it's something that came up for me as I was listening and talk, was on what is now known as AI-induced psychosis. So I don't know, I'm sure you, with an interest in this topic, have been keeping an eye on the news too, but I've been curious to read two different types of stories about AI. One was on AI-induced psychosis, where people are talking in depth to ChatGPT, for instance, and then getting very embedded in delusional, maybe extreme spiritual beliefs. But on the other side, research that has shown that engagement with something like ChatGPT can help people move away from conspiracy theories. So they may input, is this true? And if ChatGPT says, no, it isn't, then that's taken as a more neutral source than, somebody else tries to convince you. So I don't know, have you given any thought to AI in relation to your theories?
No, that's super interesting. Thank you very much. So it's not like I'm not an AI expert. So, I'm kind of just sharing some thoughts here, but I think that we do have a tendency to humanize systems like, Siri or Alexa or ChatGPT. So, we talked about the sensitive agency detection and intentionality biases. So we tend to see intentionality where there isn't sometimes. And so we tend to actually react to these intelligence systems as if they were not just intelligent systems, but also systems with, you know, kind of autonomous beliefs, desires, and intentions. And in a way, that could be both good and bad, right? So it could be good in a way because, you know, I think it's just the way we tend to be. We tend to see things as something that makes sense, and we tend to imagine that you know, our pets have much more sophisticated beliefs and desires than they are likely to have, because, you know, we have an interaction with them, and because, as Dennett was saying, this helps us actually predict what they will do a lot better than, you know, attributing much more accurate beliefs that we don't really have any ground for attributing to them, right? Maybe more simple beliefs. So I think it kind of reveals a general tendency that we have to kind of to push up the intentionality, to enhance the intentionality and the autonomy of the systems that we interact with. The neutrality point is very interesting, I think. And I've noticed that in my research as well. So one of the things that we do is talk about epistemic injustice, for instance. So this is when, especially in the medical context, you know, where the doctor or the clinician tends to have more knowledge that is recognized than the patient, then what happens is that very often there are some injustices done to patients who are not invited to actually collaborate in the clinical encounter in the way that we were describing. And some people have started arguing that, oh, maybe, you know, we should really think about Dr. Bot or kind of artificial intelligence as medical professionals, because we could take the biases away from them and have less of that epistemic injustice. So something more neutral, as you were saying, you know, not affected by the same kind of biases. And I think that's an interesting idea. And I'm not saying, you know, that there isn't some promise there, but I think ultimately we are making those systems, right? And people who have started looking at how these systems work have found just the same biases, for instance, biases against you know, women reporting pain that we find in clinicians that are human and reason accordingly. So in a way, it's very difficult to think that, you know, if it's something created by us and designed by us, it's going to be more neutral or less biased than we are. I think we will need to come to some kind of realization that it's very difficult to get rid of this kind of biases, or to hope that, you know, an independent system may not have them.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we've almost after time, so I was going to ask maybe one or potentially two other questions. The first one is probably a little bit shorter. This person was wondering if there was a greater or lesser incidence of conspiracy theory in specific demographics. For example, in individuals who are not trained in rigorous scientific thinking and analysis, who may have a lower GPT or more uneducated, less levels of higher education. So I guess the person is asking here whether if this is merely a matter of rigorous education and being taught to think critically.
So science literacy and level of education are one component. So some people have noticed that, kind of science literacy and education can to some extent protect from certain conspiracy theories, but not entirely. So it's not a decisive factor. One thing that has been noticed is that very often people from traditionally marginalized communities tend to be more likely to adopt conspiracy theories just because their interests have often been neglected by the government and by the institutions, and so they've developed less trust towards government and institutions. So when the scientific community says, you know, we found the vaccine for COVID, it's less easy for them to trust them because they know that in the past, you know, they have been overlooked and they've been marginalized. So that has been one factor that is quite important. If you develop less trust in institutions, then you may be always thinking that they are out to get you. And sometimes you may be well justified to do that because you have a history of kind of induction and they've done it in the past. Why shouldn't they do it again, right? So that seems to be one factor. I haven't read anything that suggests that age in particular is a factor or gender. I think, you know, almost anybody can have conspiracy theories, and I think almost everybody has at least one conspiracy theory. I'm sure that we all have, you know, some of these idiosyncratic ideas about how things happen in a certain way. But you know, sometimes even being good at critical thinking is not actually enough, because very often conspiracy theorists define themselves as thinking for themselves, not following, you know, the crowd. So sometimes having this idea that you have to fact check things yourself is actually at the basis of some conspiracy theories, you know, that they don't trust authorities or experts, but they trust themselves. So it's not actually so easy to tell apart what conspiracy theories are doing wrong, or what people who believe in conspiracy theories are not doing right. And if you think about the psychological literature, initially people were thinking more analytical, critical style, less conspiracy theories, but it doesn't actually work that way. It's not so simple.
Yeah, I think you're right. You made a very good point there. You can be so critically thinking that you can think yourself into a conspiracy
Yes.
theory. Okay, well, we're at the end of time. I can't believe it. We've had so many thank yous already. I think some people had to leave right on the dot. I know it's the working day for many of our audience. But thank you for wonderful questions. Lots of people are saying thank you for the humanizing effect of your talk, Lisa. Also, earlier in the chat, somebody mentioned how your talk had given them a way to understand their loved ones' belief more of being a targeted person. So I think this has had, you know, a deep impact on many people, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It has been wonderful, and thank you again for all your comments and questions.
Yes, thank you. We'll be sending out the recording. Lisa, if you don't mind sending me the presentation or like a PDF of the presentation, we can send that out. But thank you so much. I hope this isn't the last time that we see you. And we'll see you for our next webinar, or maybe even our conference in November.
Thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.